If you're fresh to the photo video gear world, you may have heard people say that one of the first lenses that you should get are a 35mm or 50mm. They're not lying, but once you get those lenses, even both of those lenses, then what? Today let's talk about a special lens that may get your images to look way different and maybe even better than your 35mm and 50mm. We're talking about the 14mm f2.8 from Samyang, Mark II. I call this a specialty lens. We're shooting real estate, sometimes architecture, landscape, and straight up vlogging. Casey Neistat, vlogging extraordinaire, has a 14 to 28mm zoom lens when he vlogs. So this kind of focal range is not a joke. 14mm can go a long way in special ways. You're using this to shoot in small, tight spaces. You may want more of an environment in your shot without getting a fisheye look. What's the difference between this lens and a fisheye lens? The fisheye lens gives you a distortion in the center of the lens. However, the 14mm has a more visible distortion at the edges or the sides of the lens. If you want a different perspective on the environment, there's another thing you can capture, but you'll just have to stay tuned for that. Okay, let's talk about some pros. This thing has got rings. Not that kind of ring, not that kind of ring. It's got a locking ring for the focus ring, especially if you need to keep extra still for your shots on a tripod. It's got a clickable and declickable switch for your aperture ring, which helps you adjust your aperture smoothly, or, you could just have it nice and rough on the stops. For you videographers and aspiring filmmakers out there, you want a nice, free, click-free experience. Another thing to note about this lens is that it is great in low light, as it opens all the way up to f2.8. In regards to my experience with this lens, I used it to shoot real estate, as well as vlog a backpacking trip. Real estate though is the main reason why I bought this lens. I need the widest possible lens that I could get that can make the whole overall house and rooms feel big without crazy distortions like that fisheye lens. The vertical lines of the walls and rooms may not be completely straight on the edges, but you practically got an industry standard look that most people would love to see a house through. If you don't already have a 16 to 35mm or even Tamron 17 to 28mm, the 14mm lens is a great alternative as it's more affordable and it also delivers the same value, if not greater, than its zoom counterparts. In addition, since prime lenses are typically great on a gimbal, this lens is no exception. I had no problems and it was easy to balance on my DJI Ronin RS2 gimbal. And despite this thing being a manual lens, yeah, I know, quite a bummer, I was still able to get great dynamic shots while still being in focus. Trust me, you don't need autofocus with real estate because your autofocus would just be hunting for a subject that doesn't even need to be hunted. And if you already do have a lens with autofocus that you're going to use for real estate, you're going to want to lock off the focus anyway just to prevent that hunting. To help nail my focus, since you can't always trust the LCD, I use a tool called Focus Peaking, and it's built straight into my A7S III. It's pretty much an overlay for my image that highlights the parts that are in focus, instead of having to spend all my time checking the LCD screen saying, oh, that looks pretty in focus. Yeah, it wouldn't depend on that. Outside of a professional setting, I brought this along for backpacking. In preparation for the trip, I took it to a park to get an idea of the shots that I could get. One of those shots was the typical vlogger shot as I was pointing the camera at myself. Fortunately, with this kind of lens, you don't have to stretch out your arm all the way. You can actually fit yourself just by keeping it at this kind of distance. You can fit yourself and the environment around you and still be able to maintain that context of your story. This kind of shot can be less nauseating if your camera has IBIS to help reduce the jitters and the motion blur. But if you don't, that's okay because it's better to have a wider kind of shot and have those little jitters than a telephoto shot and have a lot of those jitters. It's less obvious. For vlogging, I personally prefer a 17 to 28mm f2.8 by Tamron just for the autofocus and the versatility of the zoom. But this Samyang still delivered well enough for me. At 14mm, I got a lot of nature in my frame. I especially like this for the kind of setup for capturing the height of the trees, giving this big world perspective for the subject. Although there is some distortions and the trees aren't all straight, just the unique perspective is eye-catching in itself. It's also art, so when it comes to those small details, forget about it. When it came down to the actual backpacking trip, I was glad that I brought this along. I was able to capture much of the views, the experience, and without too much effort. Since I wasn't and couldn't use ND filters with this kind of lens here as it's protruding, I was closing my aperture to like f16, f11, which makes everything in focus. Well, practically. And it's no big deal, that's exactly what I want to show, the scenic environment. Even when I was close to my camera for vlogging, I was still able to achieve some kind of bokeh at those f-stops, to just focus on me without having a distracting background. And as a bonus, since the Samyang is a prime lens, I was able to try out some astrophotography. I mean, bada boom, what do you think? Because it's a fast lens, I just had to set it to f2.8, throw the focus into infinity focus, crank up the ISO, and lower the shutter speed, or at least make it longer, and that's it. But don't let my shots limit your vision. Check out one of my favorite artists that use an ultra-wide lens. Alright, let's not beat around the bush. What are the downsides to the lens mic? To address the elephant in the room, yes, it's still a manual lens. If you're not used to manual lenses, this will be especially tedious for you to try to nail your focus with or even without the focus peaking tool, especially for first-time users. And if you are going to try focus peaking for the first time, it's some trial and error. Me, I set my color to red for the focus peaking lines, and I set it to high. You can play around with it, some people do it with low, practice. You can get it, it's not impossible, it's just learning, that's all it is. And this focus problem isn't really much of a problem when you're shooting at like f8, f16, f22, but it is something to consider when you're using a manual lens and using focus peaking as a complementary tool. Another downer is that, again, it's a special lens. This may be too wide for most people, and I'm not saying it's for most people. You may want to consider 24mm instead. Although similar to that of a 14mm, the 24mm is still considered a wide lens. But it's still more suitable for everyday shooting than the 14mm. We shoot at 24mm with our phone. Anything wider than that, you're going to look like you're shooting with a GoPro in terms of focal length. And as wide as it gets, you're going to get distortion. You're definitely going to notice this when you take pictures. Ideally, you won't be taking up close and personal shots with this when it comes to portraits because it's going to make your face look funky. Yes, there are post-processing adjustments that can be made to lessen the distortion, but I wouldn't want to push it for those kinds of portraits. But it's art, so you do what you want. And the last downer, of course, is that it's a prime lens. You may not wind up using it very often. This, of course, is not the fault of the lens. It's still a great lens. But if you want something ultra wide without fully committing to a single focal length, you can opt for a zoom lens like the Tamron to 728 f2.8. I like that. Or a 16 to 35mm f2.8 or f4, whatever variant you'd like. I mean, what's the widest lens that you use? Alright, who is this for? I say this is a great lens for real estate shooters, especially starting out. For the value that you get out of this lens, the price sure is justified. If you're in need of a 14mm lens, this is definitely the one to get. Don't let the manual focus deter you from considering this, especially for real estate. As you're using a gimbal, you'll be fine as you explore different shots of rooms and not have to worry about focus hunting. In addition to being a real estate shooter, this could be very good for landscape shooters who also want that vast look of their environment and don't have a lot of room to back up or have the kind of elevation to get a bigger picture. I love the cost, quality, and image and shots that I get from this. You don't always need autofocus to get the shot that you need. Shooting 14mm, you can easily grab things into focus. If you're not into shooting landscapes, real estate, or stars, this lens may be a pass for you. And you may want to consider checking out my 24mm video right over here. Thanks again for watching. Now go out there and shoot for the life that matters. See ya!